It says, Jordan was assured the problem should not affect his ability to perform, and he has been as effective as ever in the exhibition games, despite admittingly not coming into camp in complete shape, which experts say might have exacerbated the tendinitis. Absolutely. You come in out of shape, and all of a sudden, like I said, you ramp up the workload. Maybe he wasn't playing much, maybe he wasn't working out much, and then all of a sudden training camp hits. That is the classic case of where tendinopathies start. Or for a lot of you young hoopers, you're not doing much. You take 3 weeks off. Maybe you're working out and doing some skills training, and then you go play 4 games. Boom. Huge spike in workload. I'm actually amazed that any hooper makes it out of their AAU days without any tendinopathies. Like, that shows how durable the body really is. But with AAU, we're getting these huge spikes in workload because it's not like the AAU tournament directors are like, hey, day 1, you only play 1 game, and then next week you play 2 games, and then next week you play 3 games. It's just like nothing to all of a sudden you're playing 4 games. And I think that's where a lot of the tendinopathies come, especially because when you really dive into the research, as Jill Cook would say, I believe she says it is a young man's injury. So it's way more common in men than women. And it's way more common in young athletes, so young jumping athletes. Can you get it in other ways? Yes, but it's mostly those spring forces. When the tendon has to rapidly store and release elastic energy, that's when we get it. And we can get it in the weight room as well. It's a little less common, but you do see it in like Olympic weightlifters, power lifters. If you're like doing anything max intent in really low positions, you see people always pushing full range of motion. If you're going full range of motion really heavy, that's a lot of load on a stretched tendon, right? And that can cause it. Bouncing out of the bottom, so Olympic lifting movements where you're getting in that really deep knee flexion and we're trying to move fast out of the bottom. I've never seen heavy loads at partial ranges or half ranges cause any problems, but full ranges is typically where you see more of the anterior knee pain. Jordan had hoped the problem would disappear with rest in the summer, but it flared up again early in training camp. So that's really interesting. So he probably had it the previous season, and then doctors told him to rest. And so he probably took the entire off season completely off, rested, and then thought it was going to go away. And I can almost guarantee you, because this is what's happening to a lot of young players now, is when the doctor tells them rest, ice, inflammation, they do it. Guess what happens? They feel better. Why? Because they removed the load. It's not a secret that we can get you feeling better with rest. Now, the problem is the tendon decreases capacity. So now you can just go out for a jog and all of a sudden it starts hurting again, let alone talk about getting back into jumping, let alone talk about getting back into playing basketball. And so you drop the capacity of the tendon. And so now even really light exercise can flare up that tendon. And so Jordan was probably told, hey, rest, take it easy. And that's why he came into camp that year out of shape, not because he's lazy, but because he thought that rest would be good for him. And that just made it worse because now he's ramping back up into playing basketball, and that's just going to wreak havoc on the tendon. Yeah, the first noticeable effects of Jordan's tendinitis occurred last season in the playoff series against the Philadelphia 76ers. Okay, so it came on late, maybe overuse. He's playing a lot. He's in the playoffs. Overuse, it starts, it gets bad. Summer comes, rest the entire time. Worst thing you can do. Luckily, we now know that that's the worst thing you can do. He was seen limping on the court from the effects of the tendinitis, which that's when you know your tendinopathy is really bad, when you're limping on the court. When it affects your play, it's really bad because a lot of us have tendinopathy, right? But when you get warmed up and you get that adrenaline in the game and you get focused and your mind gets lost in the game, pains go away. Man, if it's minor, if it's even a moderate level of tendinopathy, you're not going to feel it while you're playing. You're usually going to feel it after you cool down. You're going to feel it on the long car rides when you're in deep knee flexion, that type of stuff. Now, one thing that I've always found with tendinopathy, and this is actually supported with Dr. Ebony Rio's research, is there's such a huge mental component two tendinopathies. So here's an example. Athlete A has a tendinopathy, athlete B has a tendinopathy. Let's say it's the same exact level. Athlete A feels it. He's in debilitating pain. Athlete B has no idea that he even has a tendinopathy. That's how it works. It's a brain thing. It's a nerve thing. So sometimes you have it and you don't feel it. There's people that probably developed it in adolescence. You developed it maybe in AAU ball when you were 13 years old, and you might not feel it until you're 21. All of a sudden, something happens, you overload it and you feel it. You might not have developed it then. Michael Jordan might not have developed it during that series or during that season. It might have happened earlier, and sometimes you don't feel it for a long time because that's how complex pain really is. It's not straightforward, especially when it comes to tendinopathies. Now, side note, I'm not a doctor. Talk to your doctor, talk to your physical therapist about whether you should be trying to play through tendinopathies. In my experience, I've seen that a lot of players play through it successfully, and as long as you're managing load and doing your work, keeping it strong in the weight room, doing your isometrics, all that good stuff, they tend to be fine. That tends to not be a career ruiner. But if you're feeling it in games, like Michael Jordan is feeling it in games to the point where he's limping, that's a bit scary, right? That's where that could turn into a full patellar tendon rupture, in my opinion.